This is what Vietnam looks like after the chaotic fall of Saigon in 1975. Decimated cities, re-education camps, and starving children could be seen no matter where you looked in the country. The northern Vietnam in particular had suffered near total destruction of factories and farmlands thanks to the US bombing raids during that war. And when the Western superpowers finally left the country alone, it fell to the hands of the Communist Party of Vietnam, or CPV, which was quickly overwhelmed by the drastic economic situation of their country. The biggest issue for them was the severe shortage of food and an economy that just couldn't sustain itself. The CPV tried the policy of nationalization, hoping it would solve all of Vietnam's problems. They also implemented its core financial policy of not allowing any private commerce or trade by the so-called capitalist merchants. This effectively put a stop to any kind of foreign investment that the country desperately needed. After all, with a per capita income of around $140, Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the world at the starting of the 1980s. This extreme economic pressure, however, ended up becoming the catalyst for revolutionary economic reforms. These reforms, which were called Doi Moi, were aimed at making the socialist country more accessible to private investors and companies. This wasn't a completely new idea since China had already proven that this model can lead to explosive financial growth. So, armed with this new policy, CPV allowed for profit companies to set up their operations in Vietnam. What followed was a remarkable turnaround for a country that was written off by most nations after 2 decades of war. The country now sits proudly as the 4th largest exporter of textiles in the world, with an industry that's worth nearly $40 billion. It has also become a major player in the world of tech export and oil production. And as you can expect, these industries have not only raised millions of people out of poverty, but have also raised the standards of living significantly. The FDI paradox. However, this miraculous growth isn't just without its problems, and recently these problems have started coming to light in the aftermath of the pandemic. You see, one of the biggest factors behind Vietnam's rise as an industrial giant is foreign direct investment, or FDI. Now, as the name suggests, foreign direct investment is a financial term used for the money that's poured into a country by foreign parties who usually acquire assets, businesses, or real estate in return. In the case of Vietnam, almost 80% of the FDI has gone into manufacturing, which is exactly why the country is now considered a genuine competitor for a powerhouse like China. All of this happened over the years because Vietnamese government has slowly removed pretty much all restrictions against owning a business in the country. They have given tax incentives, made land reforms, and even allowed 100% ownership of businesses to make sure that the country remains a good choice for foreign investors. And when you remember the fact that Vietnam has a highly educated and cheaper workforce, you can see why it has been rolling out in foreign capital for years now. But despite its overwhelmingly positive effects on the economy, FDI is no magic bullet. Over the years, economists have begun warning that Vietnamese economy is becoming too reliant on foreign investments. And to make things worse, this foreign investment isn't being used in the most optimal way. You see, like in the 80s, Vietnam doesn't have crippling poverty anymore. It now has a skilled population that demands jobs with better pay. Now, this wouldn't have been a problem had the industry also transformed over the last 40 years, but that's not the case. In Vietnam, most of the FDIs are still being pumped into cheap manufacturing industries that can employ highly skilled workers. Instead of investing in high-tech product assemblies for cars and semiconductors, foreign investors are happily putting their money into textile and basic food packaging facilities. Another big problem with these basic assembly lines is the fact that they need large swaths of land, which isn't ideal when you're trying to improve your agricultural production. Then, there's also the question of participation by local investors in the overall economy. Initially, the government required foreign partners to share their businesses with local players. Now the country doesn't have those restrictions, and because of that, the share of local businesses in the overall industrial sector is always lower than the norm. Issues with the labor force. Another big problem with the Vietnamese financial model rests simply with the fact that it depends heavily on its cheap labor. This affordable workforce has allowed it to compete with countries like China and South Korea. This model, however, is not sustainable in the long run. Just look at the Japanese industry that suffered a lot when it failed to compete with South Korea, whose cheaper workforce has made it ideal for heavy industries. Vietnam is heading towards a similar situation where educated young people are now asking for better wages. You can't really ignore these demands forever, but you can't also really raise the wages too much because then you might lose some key investors. The country is already facing the loss of apparel giant Adidas, which is planning to close assemblies in Vietnam and some other countries. This sudden move is a result of incredible advancements in automation technology. Adidas and many more other companies are now thinking about closing down offshore assembly lines and moving production to automated factories in their own countries. This is another big challenge for countries like Vietnam, and it can drastically affect their exports. Human rights concerns. And if these 21st century problems weren't enough, Vietnam is also facing a social monster from a bygone era. I'm of course talking about the authoritarian rule, which has given birth to all sorts of human rights problems that just can't be ignored anymore. Even the US is now openly reporting serious humanitarian issues, which doesn't bode well for Vietnam as the Western powerhouse is its second largest trade partner. In a 2022 report, the US Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor pointed out specific incidents where Vietnamese authorities were directly responsible for unlawful killings, torture, arbitrary arrests, and for not giving many people a fair trial. Amnesty International, on the other hand, conveyed serious concerns over the suppression of freedom and expression in the country. They pointed out the cases where prominent journalists were arrested for no clear reason and were not given a fair trial. These glaring used to be swept under the carpet by most investors in the past, but no public company can justify investing in such an authoritarian state anymore, especially when you have other candidates like Philippines, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. The threat of the middle-income trap. And now that you understand what kind of deep-rooted issues really plague the Vietnamese economy, you can finally understand why many economists wonder if the country can really get out of the middle-income trap. For those of you who haven't heard of this term before, it refers to the income situation where a developing country fails to transition from a middle-class income country to a high-income nation. As of now, a country will be categorized as a middle-income one if its per capita income stays between $1,000 to $12,000. Over the years, even some of the most promising economies like South Africa and Brazil have failed to escape middle-income trap. Even China hasn't joined the ranks of high-income countries so far, but that will change in a couple of years according to most estimates. Vietnam, however, has a very tough road ahead as its economy faces all the roadblocks that are telltale signs of a country heading into a middle-income trap. Its industry lacks clear diversification and modernization, and it also doesn't have the best labor conditions anymore. Then there is the issue of a rapidly aging population, as people over 60 already make up 12% of its total population, and this number will grow significantly over the next decade. You add a lack of foreign investment into this toxic mixture, and you can see why the economy might start to choke in the upcoming decades. It's hard to maintain a 7% growth rate if you are not enticing enough to get FDI and don't have the means to generate capital to fuel such growth. Luckily, Vietnam still has the time to change this grim future. But the real problems this time around are much more complicated and can't really be solved in a year or so. The Vietnamese government will have to adopt policies that force foreign investors to put capital in the more skilled heavy industries. The country will also need to upgrade its labor force if it wants to stay competitive. The government will also have to reduce its direct impact on the economy by selling state-owned airlines and power companies that have been in the red for years now. The issues of human rights and the aging population will need more insight, as you often require specific legislation to deal with them. Out of the 101 countries that were in the middle-class income range in 1960, only 13 escaped the middle-class income trap by 2008. This shows the daunting scale of the challenge that Vietnam faces currently, but I would never be the one to bet against a country that has a history of defying extreme odds.